Okay, welcome to lecture two. This will be a shorter lecture than the first one, so we should be able to do it all in one video. So chapter three is about David Hume. Specifically, it argues that David Hume espoused a form of skepticism or radical doubt, and that's often considered the last word in philosophy. He kind of proved that according to himself, he proved, and many others, he proved that we're not really capable of knowing anything. So that kind of puts a halt to philosophy's attempt to devise answers to big existential questions. He was sort of considered a devil's advocate, meaning he worked at disproving all of the methods of knowing that other philosophers were using, and sort of uprooted philosophy at the time and pretty much ever since. Hume's fork is the idea that all justifiable beliefs are either a relation of ideas or a matter of fact, which can be experientially confirmed. So that we know everything through reason or experience, but he's going to show that some of our forms of reasoning are faulty and not justified. He divides all forms of perception into impressions and ideas. And impressions are basic units of sensory experience, so actual sensations like experiencing hot or cold, passions, and emotions. Impressions are perceptions, according to Hume, which enter with the most force and violence versus ideas. So this is a revolutionary idea that Hume had. He pointed out that if you burn your hand on your stove, the actual experience of burning your hand is way more vivid than later on your recollection or memory or idea of burning your hand. And that's a huge difference between, like, Descartes, for example, that thinks ideas are what we should focus on. Hume saying that impressions are the foundations of ideas, that all ideas can be broken down into impressions. And that when you really think about it, mental phenomenon, if I tell you to picture a red square, you can do that, but it's a pretty weak mental picture. Your mental pictures are pretty weak compared to actually perceiving a red square in the external world. So he says all ideas come from impressions, come from sensory experience. And he argues that impressions and ideas can be simple or complex. And sort of summarizing a major piece that you read in this chapter, he says that all our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions, which are correspondent to them and which they exactly represent. So complex ideas are arrangements of simple ideas, and all simple ideas are derived from simple impressions. So this wasn't in the textbook, but that's where he claims we get the idea of God. So he's an atheist, and he argues that we have simple ideas of, like, what our experience of, like, our limitations of our own power, for example, limitations of our own knowledge, knowing things and having power over things, and our experience of those limitations are experienced through simple impressions that are then put together as ideas, simple ideas, and then they become complicated ideas or complex ideas. Like, we have a notion of power or knowledge, and then God is sort of this projection of a being with ultimate power and ultimate knowledge. But if you break it down, it's based on our experience of the world. It's sort of like an idealized version of ourselves that's derived from impression. So he makes that argument at a different point in Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which you had read excerpts of. So he argues that there are three major unjustified beliefs, and this sort of shakes to the foundation our ability to know anything, really. So if you'll remember from lecture one, The area of philosophy that's concerned with what it means to know something and is concerned with the study of knowledge is called epistemology. And we talked about how religious faith and considering the difference between faith and reason or faith and knowledge is like an epistemological conversation. Well, David Hume's discussion of what kind of beliefs or forms of knowledge are justified and unjustified is also an epistemological conversation. So the first unjustified belief is causation, or he calls it causality. So this is the relation of cause and effect of one event bringing about or causing another event. So he argues that our knowledge of causation is not a priori, or a priori means before the fact. So it means like before experience. Instead, our knowledge of causation is based on experience. And this is a new word that wasn't in the book. That means a posteriori. It's good to know what a priori and a posteriori mean. So a posteriori just means from experience or after the fact of experiencing something. And he argues that causation, our knowledge of causation, is actually just the constant conjunction, the joining together of two events in a way that's based on custom. So he reduces causation and argues that it's basically just customary conjunction. You have observed that the sun rises every day, so you assume that the sun is going to rise the next day. So you assume that if you're playing pool, for example, or billiards, that if you hit one ball into another ball, the other ball will move. And if you really think about it, if we asked why that's the case, you can keep giving answers, okay, based on your knowledge of physics, and you could get to some sort of like quantum, subatomic level of talking about what's happening when you hit one ball into the other. But you can always keep asking why, another layer of why. And so basically, like cause and effect, and you can do that with any relation of cause and effect. You can keep asking why, and there's no way of really articulating that relationship, because an effect is not contained within a cause. They are two separate things. So you can't ever really explain how they are related to each other. If you can always ask another layer of why, and when you're dissecting that relation. And so basically, where you get a causal relationship is just through custom of saying this event is typically followed by this event, therefore they have a causal relationship. And it's just custom. It's just a customary conjoining or putting together of two events and claiming that they have some sort of causal relationship. But that actual causal relationship can never be fully articulated, and therefore it's unjustified. The principle of universal causation is just the idea that every event has a cause, that causation is basically the explanation for why all events around us are happening. And you'll remember the principle of universal causation is the major premise in Aristotle's first cause, in Aquinas' first cause argument for the existence of God. The second major unjustified belief that Hume kind of uproots is the principle of induction. So this is predicting the future based on past observations. And this involves assuming the future will be like the past in some ways. Okay, of course, the future will be somewhat different from the past, like the book explains, you'll be older, whatever. But that there are patterns, and that the future has at least the same physical laws as the past, for example. And Hume points out to infer that the future will be like the past, because the future has always been like the past, is actually committing the fallacy of begging the question. Therefore, it's a vicious cycle. It's a logical loop that cannot be justified. The third unjustified belief that Hume uproots is the belief in the external world, that a physical or material world exists independently of our impressions and ideas, which it presumably causes in us. It's a really basic way of explaining like how we experience the world and ourselves. And he says this basic idea is not justified because to derive the conclusion that there is this independent external world, to get there, you have to assume causation and induction. You have to be able to put together patterns of observation and make and infer based on those patterns of causation, and induce that this external world exists. And as we demonstrated, induction is not entirely logically sound. So, putting it all together, the notion of causality or causation supports the principle of induction. You can infer that the future will be like the past according to induction because it has always been like the past. So that's based on the fact that you have observed causal patterns again and again and again. So based on those causal patterns, which as he mentioned, you can never fully explain, it's just customary conjunction, it's not actually justified. Therefore, induction is not justified. And since the causal theory of perception supports our belief in the external world, that is not justified either. So what are you capable of knowing? You can't know that there's an external world. You can't actually it's not justified. You can know that, but it's not justified. You cannot justify belief in predicting the future based on past observations, and you can't even explain the patterns that you're seeing in terms of causation, in terms of these events having a relationship to each other, because you can never actually explain that relationship. And this breaking down of causation is going to be brought up again in the next chapter, in chapter 5, when we talk about the relationship of the mind and the body. That's a good example of applying Hume's uprooting of the relationship of causation. So he argues that reasoning alone without information from experience cannot tell us anything whatsoever about the world. So Descartes' whole methodology of hyperbolic doubt, of doubting everything, and starting with the notion that you're a thinking thing, starting with mind and thought and idea, and doubting the sensory world, Hume completely inverts this and says, no, your experience of the sensory world is the most vivid and forceful form of knowing that you exist and experiencing the world. And so therefore he argues reasoning a priori, the way Descartes tries to do, before experience, is incapable of proving the existence of substances, including the mind as a mental substance, of God and causes, as well as the conformity of future events to past ones. So if you take all of Hume's ideas seriously, you're going to be basically living in a state of madness. Like if you take his radical form of skepticism about even causation, induction, and the fact that, and the idea there's an external world, if you doubt all that seriously, you're not going to be able to function. But Hume was actually known to be an extremely sociable, friendly, well-adjusted individual, and he was very popular, socially popular at his time. But he had these beliefs. So he says, even though you can't justify these beliefs, you still need to assume them to be able to function in society. It just adds like a peculiar flavor to your experience of the world, to know that the way that you make sense of it isn't necessarily justified. That's important. That should give you a sense of humility about what you are capable of actually knowing, what you are capable of proving. So before you start jumping to conclusions about God or this or that, according to Hume, the soul, all these basic beliefs that everyone claims that they have complete knowledge about, he says you can't even justify the ways that we come to know anything. So you should be very humble about any worldview that you construct. So that's kind of the takeaway. It isn't that you should actually doubt in your everyday life causation. That would be that'd get you into a lot of trouble. You couldn't assume that the next time you tried to take a step that you wouldn't float away. So because you can't assume gravity then. So you should definitely not try to live by this. So we're on to the questions from chapter 3. What are 3 major unjustified beliefs according to David Hume? Explain each one and why, according to Hume, they are unjustified. So the first one is causation, and you should explain because the reason why he thinks it's unjustified is because you can never fully articulate the relationship between a cause and an effect. That relationship is really just you crudely conjoining the cause and the effect together based on custom and based on the fact that you have customarily viewed them as following each other. The second one is induction. You should explain what induction it is. It's assuming that that you can make predictions about the future based on the past, assuming that the future will be like the past in some way. And this is unjustified because it's based on causation. And the third unjustified belief is belief in the external world, because to derive a conclusion that there is an independent external world that's giving you impressions from which all your impressions and ideas are derived is based on the principle of induction and causation, which are both unjustified. So they all build off each other, and that's why they are all unjustified. According to Hume, what is the difference between impressions and ideas? So impressions are sensory perceptions, emotions, and passions, and ideas are sort of mental images or mental arrangements of impressions. And impressions have primacy, and Hume knows this because you can reduce any sort of idea to complex idea into simple ideas, which are derived from simple impressions. And a really profound example that sort of supports all this is that your actual experience of sensory experience of heat or cold is way more vivid, and any sensory experience is way more vivid than mental recollection of it. So he says that it's sense experience and emotion and passion which have primacy, not weak mental phenomenon. So, chapter 5. So, a mind and body introduction. So, this is a chapter on mind and body. So, a lot of students confuse the word conscious and the concept of consciousness with the word conscience. So conscious, to be conscious or have consciousness is to basically be online, to be aware of your experience of perceptions. So it's, if you're awake, you're conscious, basically. Your conscience is this concept of something, that a faculty that you possess that enables you to distinguish right from wrong. So the reason why I'm putting them together is because they sound very similar, and sometimes in students' papers, students confuse these two concepts, but they're not actually related. And it's important to know that consciousness and to be conscious is different from self-consciousness. People often, when they hear the term conscious or consciousness, they think that what you're talking about is self-awareness. That is self-consciousness. So you can be conscious or have a consciousness without being self-conscious or having self-consciousness. So for example, a dog might be online and can experience pain and pleasure and has an inner world, but might not be able to recognize itself in a mirror, for example. So it's not like a dog might not be totally self-conscious. I mean, I don't know exactly, but that would be an example that might help you sort through these ideas. And in this chapter, and what guides this conversation is what's called the mind-body problem, which is just the question of how are mind and body related. And two terms that are going to be helpful for sorting through this conversation are qualia and phenomenology. So qualia is your actual experience of mental states, the phenomenon of experiencing the blueness of blue. Okay, so you like the fact that we can ask questions like, do you experience color the way I do? Is blue red? Is my blue your red, for example? Like maybe we experience color differently. It's a question about qualia. It's a question about your inner world and that experiential quality of your inner world. And phenomenology is a whole field within philosophy that's concerned with your qualia, with your experience of the world. So, for example, we know the sun does not actually rise, the earth revolves around the sun. But from a phenomenological perspective, from the perspective of a human being living on planet Earth, we experience the sun as appearing to rise. So, from our phenomenological perspective, the sun rises, even though that's not true. So, those are some helpful terms. So, what is consciousness? The first person to really consider, and this is like the most conservative and common way that people in the West think of mind and body, is Cartesian dualism. The Cartesian word comes from Descartes, okay? And this is the idea that the mind and the body are of two different substances. So your body is a physical substance or a complex of physical substances, and your mind is a thinking thing. It is a mental substance. And he also argues that the mind can exist without the body because they are two totally separate substances. But the problem with this is, how can two different substances interact? Then how are they related? So this is kind of like applying Hume's problem of causation. Like, what is that magical relationship between two things then, if we want to say that they interact with each other? And Spinoza resolved this later by espousing what's called property dualism. So if substance dualism is the most conservative response, property dualism, because usually it means that there can be an afterlife, that the mind can exist independently from the body. Property dualism is still a form of dualism where the mind and body are different, but they're different attributes of one substance. So they're different aspects or attributes of one substance. So they're not totally separate substances. The mind and the body holistically are something. They are you. But they're just different attributes of one substance or different properties of one substance. So like take a red apple, for example. One property of the apple is the color red. The other property of the apple is its texture. Those are different properties. So the mind and body are different properties of one substance, you or the apple in this example. But you can have the same problem with this that you do with substance dualism. But how do you articulate how these attributes are coordinated? How do they interact with each other if they're still somewhat separated? So this is the problem of dualism. So Descartes, in addition to thinking that the mind and the body are separate and different substances, and that the mind therefore can exist without the body, also believed in causal interactionism, that mental states cause physical states and physical states cause mental states. So mental states can do things to the body and cause things in the body. For example, if I have a mental state where I am willing to raise my hand, that mental state somehow results in me physically raising my hand. But physical states can also cause mental states. If I burn my hand, I will experience an unpleasant mental state where I am aware of experiencing pain, for example. So, and this is sort of intuitive. This is kind of how we experience ourselves. We sort of think of our mind as this non-physical thing in our skulls that controls our body, but that also receives information from our body. So that's why it's the most common, view. It's kind of intuitive. So that question of if minds and bodies are separate substances or they're separate attributes, how do they operate and coordinate? How do they interact with each other? Parallelism was a resolution proposed by Leibniz shortly after Descartes, and he argued that minds and bodies operate in coordination without actually interacting. So this requires God. So there's a mental world and mental phenomenon that seems to be coordinated with bodily phenomena. Like I want to raise my hand and I have a mental state of willing to raise my hand and my hand is raised. He's saying that it wasn't that your mental state raised your hand. It was that God coordinated these two phenomena so that you experienced them as interacting. That was how Leibniz dealt with this problem. Bertrand Russell was another property dualist and espoused dual aspect theory. So this is just like a linguistic difference, that our experiences and ideas were one aspect, those mental states of certain events or activities, of which the various chemical reactions of the brain were another aspect. So your mental states are an aspect of another aspect is like the chemical reactions in your brain that are causing these mental states. So that's like similar to Spinoza's property dualism. It's a form of property dualism still. Instead of using the term attribute, that the mind and the body are different attributes of you, and saying that they're different aspects of you. So it's kind of just a subtle difference. And again, the question with this is, what is the mysterious holistic something of which the mind and body are merely aspects of? That's sort of a limitation that Russell was not able to answer. So now we're going to look at different perspectives other than dualism. And these are really interesting because in the West, we sort of assume Cartesian dualism. And that's what people usually assume who have never been afforded the opportunity to think about it like you are right now. So before we get there, the rejection of dualism tends to lean towards more physiological explanations of mind. So physiology just means the study of the physical world, of the physical body. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the brain. And the hard question of consciousness is a term in this conversation that refers to, if you provide more physiological explanations of the mind, how do you explain qualia? How do you explain mental states, like our actual non-physical experiences of the world through our mental states? So a rejection of dualism is epiphenomenalism, and this is sort of a centrist idea. This is kind of what I think. I mean, I don't know ultimately. I mean, I'm pretty agnostic about everything, but this makes a lot of sense to me, that that mental states or your experience of your mind in qualia is epiphenomenon that is caused by brain states. So your mental states are caused by brain states. They're somewhat different. I mean, they're non-physical when brain states are physical or chemical, electrical activity in your brain. But what an epiphenomenalist believes is that it's just like your mental world and qualia is just your experience of brain states, and that mental states cannot causally interact with brain states, even though they are entirely caused by them. So there's one-way causal interaction, where Descartes and a lot of property dualists think the mind can act on the brain and the brain can act on the mind. Epiphenomenalists say your mind is an experience of what's happening in your brain. It doesn't cause anything in your brain. Your brain causes things within itself, and your mind is your experience of that. Basically, it's epiphenomena. It arises out of what's happening in the brain, but and therefore cannot causally interact with the brain. Moving a little bit more to the left and a more radical perspective is logical behaviorism. So this is the argument that the mind is the pattern of our behavior, not something behind it. And this is what Gilbert Ryle, who you read excerpts from, is arguing, that everything mental is really just a disposition to behave in certain ways. So this is sort of a linguistic argument. This is sort of arguing that when we talk about mental states, what we really need to be talking about is behavior, because what's relevant in talking about mental states is the types of behavior that they espouse. And he argues, Gilbert Ryle argues that, like, typically the hard question of consciousness, and a metaphor that has been used is it's the search for the ghost in the machine, where the brain is the machine and the mind is a ghost. And he says when we think of the hard question of consciousness and when we think of it as the hunt for the ghost in the machine, we're making a category error, because ghosts and machines are totally different. And even though mental states are non-physical and brain states are physical, they are not categorically different somehow. And logical behaviorism differs from radical behaviorism because logical behaviorism is not a theory about behavior and its causes, but a theory about the language of mind. So that we shouldn't even be really talking about mental states and the meaning of mentalistic terms like want and believe. So when you say, I want something or I believe something, what's relevant is the types of behaviors that those wants and beliefs engender in you. So moving even further towards a more counterintuitive or radical idea when it comes to the mind-body problem is identity theory. So this goes a little bit beyond behaviorism, where mental events and certain bodily events, or specifically brain events, are identical. So an identity theorist argues that mental states are reports of processes that happen to be identical to brain processes. So the limitation with identity theory is maybe we'll get there with neuroscience, but right now we have proven there's a correlation between brain processes and mental states. We can prove that, like you can do an experiment where you stimulate certain parts of someone's brain, and by doing that, give them certain mental states or experiences. So there's a correlation between parts of the brain and experiences of mental states, but you cannot identify them with each other entirely. Correlation is not yet identity. One of the most radical perspectives is what's called eliminative materialism, which says it's basically identity theory that mental states can be completely reduced to brain processes and physical states, but it also argues that our entire way of talking about ourselves and saying I, the letter I, is basically just a form of folk psychology that's going to be completely uprooted once we prove that mental states are brain processes and that you are entirely a physical entity. My dog's by me and is like trying to dig in the carpet and is making noise. Excuse me. Stop it. Okay. And then the next perspective is functionalism, which is sort of another extension of identity theory and eliminative materialism. And it argues that the brain is an organic computer and that minds are produced not so much by particular kinds of materials, but by the relations between parts. So it's just like a form of eliminative materialism that thinks it's helpful to use the description of the brain as like an organic computer. So this isn't in the textbook, but this is, since we talked about Hume in this lecture, this is what Hume had to say about the mind and your experience of yourself. He said of himself, "For my part, when I enter most intimately in what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and I never can observe anything but the perception. If anyone, upon serious and unprejudiced reflection, thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can reason no longer with him. All I can allow him is that he may be in the right as well as I, and that we are essentially different in this particular. He may perhaps perceive something simple and continued which he calls himself, though I am certain there is no such principle in me." So that's astounding. This was like centuries ago that Hume said this. So he basically argued your sense of I, your sense of self, is like an I function that structures perception. There's no entity that is you. Your mind, the self that exists in your mind, is just how perception itself is structured. There's nothing but perception going on in your mind. It's just structured in such a way that it gives you the illusion that there's this continuous I that's experiencing and watching all these perceptions. But when you think about it, you can't ever observe that I. You can only just observe the perceptions, and you can never catch that I without a perception. And this is very similar to how Buddhists understand the self. So in Hinduism, they believe in the soul or the Atman, and in Buddhism, they believe in the Anatman or non-self. So they think everything that exists in reality is empty and impermanent. What gives the illusion that things exist is the relationship between other things. So everything exists relationally, but there's no substance to anything. Everything is ultimately empty and impermanent and in flux. So it's like basically everything that exists is like a dance without a dancer, a song without anyone playing the instruments, and that the self is like that too. It's like ultimately just this empty thing. And it's very similar to what Hume has described. So there's a parallel there. So putting it all together, it's good to kind of synthesize all this and think of substance dualism is the most sort of intuitive way and classical way we think of the mind-body problem, where mind and body are separate substances that can act on each other, and therefore the mind can exist independently without the body. Property dualism is moving a little bit further away from that sort of intuitive experience and saying the mind and body are different aspects or different attributes of the same thing. Epiphenomenalism is the next step. It's sort of a centrist move, saying that the body, specifically the brain, causes mental states, and mental states are not therefore independent from the brain. So the mind can't exist without the body, and the mental states cannot cause things in the brain. They are just epiphenomenon that arise out of the brain. The brain causes things within itself. Behaviorism is basically the argument that when we talk about mental states, that doesn't really matter. What we need to be talking about is behavior, that mental states can be reduced to behavior. Identity theory is going a little bit further and arguing that mental states are identical to brain processes. They are completely reduced to brain states. Functionalism is the argument that you can take identity theory and think of it as the brain is an organic computer, and mind just sort of arises out of it. But again, it's just this organic computing device. And eliminative materialism takes identity theory and functionalism even further and says that once we are able to demonstrate entirely that mental states are identical to brain processes, this is going to revolutionize the way that we talk about ourselves. We're going to get rid of this folk psychology of talking about our inner world, basically. So it's a really radical idea. So our questions: what is consciousness? What is the mind-body problem? What are Descartes' thoughts on the mind-body problem? What is a limitation of Descartes' ideas? So consciousness is being online or aware, not necessarily self-aware. The mind-body problem is the question of how are the mind and body related. Descartes' thoughts are that the mind and the body are separate substances, entirely different substances, that they both can interact with each other. The mind can cause bodily states, the body can cause mental states, and that the mind can exist independently without the body. You need to be able to say all of those things. What is a limitation of Descartes' ideas is that you can never fully articulate how these separate substances interact with each other. What are substance dualism, property dualism, epiphenomenalism, and identity theory? I just explained that on the last slide, so you can just move the video back a little bit for that. What is the hard question of consciousness? And that is how do you explain qualia, which is that mental inner world that is experiencing perception. And phenomenology is the study of how a subject experiences their qualia. All right, and that is it for lecture 2.